Mark Johnson come and talk about the Chinese in Montana. So I'll hand it over to him.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany. I just want to thank I know you're clapping for her generosity and the work that they do here because you haven't heard me talk yet. You don't know how this is going to go. I just want to thank Brittany and John. They do great work at Bannack State Park. And how special an opportunity for me to get to speak here, literally across the street where the Chinese community resided, in one of the most important places in all of Montana history. And I would say if my mom were here, she lives in Great Falls, she would think this is pretty special. She always wanted a priest in the family, right? Speaking in a church, that's kind of close, get kind of close. So here's my contact information. When I give talks like this, I'm sorry, I got to stay in the camera. I won't
no, you can water.
When I give talks like this, oftentimes people bring their own experiences and family history and regional history and want to share an idea with me or a source or a question. I'm very happy to go back and forth by email and help build my knowledge as we kind of combine to try and tell our states and our regions really fascinating history. So I'm from Great Falls originally. I live in Helena now, but I work for the University of Notre Dame. Anybody who knows where that is thinks, why does he live in Helena and work for the University of Notre Dame? These are my students currently, and the projector is doing its best, so bear with us. These are my students currently. I train graduate students at the University of Notre Dame who are earning their master's degree in education. All of June and July, I'm out there in South Bend, Indiana. Nothing against South Bend, Indiana. I love it, but Montana's home. And so I scamper back here as quickly as I can. They then get spread all across the United States to work in under-resourced Catholic schools. I don't need to be in northern Indiana to help support them in that work. So soon I will travel to 5 different places in California. I'll travel to Denver. I'll travel to Texas to help them in their work teaching in under-resourced Catholic schools. My grad students who are teachers teach anywhere from 2nd grade all the way through all the different subjects in high school. I love what I do. I've been doing this work for about 11 years for Notre Dame. My oldest son Jack is a sophomore at Notre Dame, so we kind of enjoy that college experience. Really privileged to get to do this work. Before that though, I was a high school history teacher, and these were my students. So I trained at Carroll College in Helena, Montana, but I've never taught in Montana. Taught initially in Boston, then in Seattle, and my wife and I wanted to see the world a little bit, so we moved to Shanghai, China. Had never been to China before a day in our lives, just took a leap of faith with the 1.5-year-old at the time, said let's go explore the world. And it was wonderful. These are my students, and you can see from the flags that they're proudly holding, they were from all over the place. I was teaching American history, I was teaching world history, Chinese history, American literature. It's a really rich experience. And as I taught American history during the academic year, I spent my summer months back in Montana. And as you see, most of my students are Asian. I thought maybe there'd be a way to kind of combine Montana's past with what I'm doing with this wonderfully diverse group of Asian students in Shanghai. They were from Indonesia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China, all over the place. It was really exciting. And so what I started to do is dig around as much as possible to try and figure out, was there a way to take their talents, abilities, motivations, and even linguistic talents to tell Montana's diverse history even more? And if you're here at this talk, titled The Chinese in Montana, you know that there was a Chinese presence. So I started marrying these two experiences, my hometown, my home state of Montana, with my teaching abroad. And we started doing some statistical analysis of how many Chinese there were in Montana. So we came up with this graph, and you can see at the first territorial census, of course Montana wasn't a state yet, the territory of Montana in 1870, there's almost 2,000 Chinese folks in Montana. That made up about 10, maybe 12% of the non-native population of Montana. So truly here from the start, and a very important part of Montana's development. That peaks in 1890 at 2,532. I'm precise, and I try to be as specific as I can with my numbers. It's likely that each of these years is a slight undercount because some of the Chinese immigrants in Montana were here under less than legal circumstances, depending on the shifting and ever ebbing and flowing American legal system. And so they might have tried to evade government officials. Sometimes you'll hear people claim, well, only 5 appeared on the census, but we know that there was 300 in town at the time. That tends to be over-exaggerations. Sometimes you'll hear some kind of sloppier research ascribe these numbers to certain locales specifically. So Butte, America, anybody from Butte, America here? Love it, love Butte. My father-in-law's from Butte. For a long time, Butte claimed that it had 2,532 Chinese residents. Butte claimed that it had 2,532. Look at the state total. 2,532. That just was sloppy research. You'll find it in a book, and the woman who asserted that in the 1960s said Butte has 2,532. I checked her sources because I know that wasn't true, so that was the state instead of the locale, and she cited herself. Maybe not the best research, right? I went back to that original source that she cited, and in that original source she says Montana has 2,532. So it's kind of tricky to play around with these numbers. Here's a spread across the state. If you'd like to come in, there's plenty of seats if you want to push in and make a friend. We charted where they were across the state. I always get the question, Mark, how many Chinese were there in Montana? And I always have to say, well, it depends where you're talking about and when you're talking about. So this map with the different symbols, and it's hard to see on the top, but it calculates kind of when the Chinese population was at its height for each of those areas. So that white diamond in Helena you can see here had about 700 Chinese in 1870. That's when Helena's Chinese population reached its peak. Almost 700 in 1870, that was 21% of Helena's total population. A very important part of Helena's founding. Okay? And then you can see, all throughout where the railroad would have been built and all throughout the mining areas of western Montana. I stopped counting on this map at if it was 10 or lower. If it was 9 or lower, I didn't put it on the map because it would have just been too busy. There was 4 in Forsyth, 8 in Glendive, 1 in Depouillier, 2 in Choteau. So it would have gotten too busy, so just for clarity's sake, I stopped counting there. You can see the biggest population, though, was Butte, at almost 900 folks in 1891-ish, right? So probably the Rocky Mountain region's largest Chinatown was in Butte, America. And Butte has a very cool claim still to this day. The Pekin Noodle Parlor, the Pekin Cafe. Anybody ever been to the Pekin? The longest continuously operating Chinese restaurant in America is in Butte. The longest continuously operating Chinese restaurant in America. It's not San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Seattle, LA. It's in Butte. So Montana has a long and important and proud Chinese history. But I wanted, and my students wanted to get past these numbers, where they were, when they were at their height, that dramatic decline. I will say, the one exception, I said you can basically find Chinese folks anywhere across this map. The one exception is my hometown of Great Falls. Great Falls is the only city or town in Montana that said, we will not allow the Chinese to settle. And they didn't. Great Falls was a planned city. Every other city kind of just sprung up organically, right around resource extraction. You find something, people flock there, and then laws follow. From the beginning, Great Falls says, we're not going to allow Chinese folks to settle. One guy tried it in 1885. He tried to make a laundry there, and roughnecks threw him into the river, the Missouri River, and he swam across, and no Chinese tried it again until 1938. And not exactly a proud moment for my hometown. But they would have been found all across there. But I wanted to get to those stories, like I just told. And so we had to try and dive as deep as we could into the research. So here are some of my students analyzing a source. This is back in Shanghai when I was teaching there. You can see they're really diligently analyzing that source. It's a census, of course. And a census should tell us a number of things. Age, gender, occupation, where they're from, citizenship, could they read and write English, and most importantly, name. Because if we're going to use the census to then triangulate their stories, find them in immigration documents, court records, land deeds, newspaper accounts, we need to know their name. This is the census from 1870 for Bannack. We hit a dead wall, right? You can read that cursive back from 1870. It says China man, China man, China woman, China woman. So this earliest document that should give us a treasure trove for the Chinese experience in Bannack and across Montana, erases their identity, making it impossible to triangulate these people in any other way and tell their stories. Now, I didn't stop there. I'm a pretty persistent person, but this is an actual historical document, a roadblock, but also a metaphor for maybe how they were treated in early Montana history. And a lot of the other documents where they do rise to us are in this way, as objects to whom things happened. Okay, there were a variety of anti-Chinese laws, and when the Chinese were found to be in violation of those laws, or just in violation of not being white, to be honest, at certain moments in Montana's history, they were caught in the teeth of the law, and you can see they're going to be deported back to, quote, the land of opium. To deport, quote, a Chinaman. And you see these mug shots, literally with a scribe on the photo, not on their head, right? But caught up in the teeth of the deportation machinery. And there were laws throughout American history and Montana history that were very prejudicial against the Chinese. We always hear about the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. It excluded Chinese workers. Chinese workers couldn't come in after 1882. But even before that, in 1875, Chinese women were not allowed to come into America and Montana. And that one on Chinese women absolutely worked. In 1900, in Montana, there were 40 Chinese men for every one Chinese woman in Montana. 40 to 1 ratio. Because of this Page Act of 1875. What that act basically said is it assumed all Chinese women trying to get into America must be prostitutes, and to keep the moral upstanding nature of America, we weren't going to let them in. Of course, some Chinese women did work in sex work, but by no means all. But this shut the door to them. The complicating factor is also this. In 1882, it said that the Chinese could not become naturalized citizens. Every other immigrant group could go through the process. It's a hard process, but it's possible to go from being an immigrant to being an American citizen, not the Chinese. Right? In Montana, it was even more kind of onerous on them. There was what was called an Anti-Miscegenation Act. Chinese could not marry outside of their race. They had to marry within Chinese. So another way to become a citizen is, of course, to be born on American soil, right? Birthright citizenship, 14th Amendment. But if there's, by law, not many Chinese women here, and the Chinese men can't marry out of their race, it was made intentionally difficult for these Chinese immigrants to have Chinese American families. So it's a tough, tough history. And my students were interested in that, but I wanted to get past this. A caricatured Uncle Sam kicking out a caricatured Chinese person. Right? Of course that did happen, and this cartoon is from a time period when deportations happened with great rapidity in Montana and the American West. But I wanted to see them more as individuals. Understand their hopes, their dreams, their goals, who do they collaborate with, what do they look like. Instead of looking like a mugshot, this guy posed for this portrait. This is Helena, 1868, circa 1868. We're not totally sure who he is. I've got some ideas. But I want to know him, his hopes, his dreams, his family connections, rather than as somebody caught up in the Deportation Express and as a mugshot. So here in Bannack, I told you we had that Chinaman. In 1870, there were 5 Chinese residents in Bannack. Here they are, a little bit more easy to read. You can see there's 2 Chinese women. That seems odd because I just told you Chinese women weren't allowed. This is the census from 1870, though. That Page Act of 1875 made it very difficult for women to come after that. So before 1875, Chinese workers could come in and they could bring in their wives. Okay? And so here we have them. For the most part, their names have been stripped from them. We do have Nancy. Obviously not her Chinese name. She's taken on an American name or been given an American name. Now the question comes up. This is a mining camp. The Chinese absolutely mined all across western Montana, all across the American West. Why weren't there more Chinese in Bannack? Down the road in Virginia City and Alder Gulch, there were hundreds of Chinese. Pretty similar development, pretty similar resources, pretty similar industries. Why weren't there any more in Bannack? When you get to playing with the numbers, like I mentioned for Bude and 2,500 and things like that, it's easy to kind of take one newspaper article from the time, latch onto a number, and take that as gospel. I will say, for the most part, the newspapers at the time were quite anti-Chinese. And if you see a number that seems inflated, it likely was designed to ramp up kind of animosity and fear of the Chinese. Okay? So for instance, in 1870 here we get the first mention of the Chinese, and it's about that fear. Actually this is up from Helena, and it's saying a ripple effect of something that had happened. A fresh importation of, quote, Chinamen, about 300 arrived from Bannack City this morning, having been driven away from the camp by the miners. So it's telling us there were 300 here in Bannack, and they were driven away. Maybe that works because the census hadn't yet happened. Census tends to happen a little bit later in the spring and summer. So maybe there were 300, all were driven out, and only those 5 remained. Maybe. But we should find a lot more stuff if there were 300 Chinese here. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But even at the time, this was called into question. A week later, somebody says, hey, a Bannack friend at our elbow suggests the fellow who told us a whopper about the 300 Chinese being driven out. For the truth is, there's never been more than 50, quote, Chinamen in Beaverhead County. And so you can't just grasp onto one thing. You've got to corroborate it. You got to take one data point and then try to connect the dots to see if you're in fact able to assert how large the Chinese community was in any place in time. Another aside, some acquaintances of mine who work in Missoula, we're constantly giving this number in Missoula for 405 Chinese folks in Missoula. 405. It's an oddly specific number. 405, 405, 405. Question for the Montanans here. What county is Missoula City in? Missoula. This used to be Missoula County, and then it got chopped up into Ravalli and Glacier and different things. Yeah, the county population was 405, not the city population. So you've got to be careful and you've got to corroborate these things. And I tend to err low with the highest number that I can corroborate with additional evidence. The other thing was, as the placer gold played out pretty quickly, Chinese were absolutely involved in placer mining. Panning and sluicing for gold, absolutely. As it got into more industrial and lode mining, though, the amount of capital outlay that was needed wasn't available to them. Okay? And so we see that here. From 1870, on account of the exhausted state of the mines at Bannack, it's been contemplated by the various mining companies here to employ cheaper laborers this season. Hence, encouragement has been held out to the Chinamen to seek employment here, and consequently a few have already arrived, with reports that others were on their way to Bannack. A company was raised for the purpose of driving the Chinamen from the camp. That's April, so it's in that time period Chinamen have deserted Bannack and gone to other parts. So it does begin to tell us a story of, it seems like there was possibilities of Chinese settling here, maybe going to undercut wages, not actively undercutting wages on their part, but in terms of what they were going to be paid by the mining companies. And the white miners kind of said, no, we're not going to allow the wages to be undercut in that way. So maybe they were coming and then diverted. From the records, I see that 5 in 1870, and then we have in 1900, we've got 7. 5 in 1870, 7 in 1900. We do begin to have names. Okay, we do begin to have diversity of occupation, often working in laundry work, often working as cooks. Why did I jump from 1870 to 1900? The 1880 census is problematic for Beaverhead County because they didn't do a specific one that's ascribable to Bannack. They did kind of a broader 1880 census. Turns out down in Jefferson City there was about 64 Chinese, right? But it doesn't look like there were that many in Bannack. The 1890 census, which would be the richest treasure trove that we could get in terms of statistical data for the Chinese in Montana, that's when they were at their height. The 1890 census is lost to history. It burned up in the 1920s, back in Washington, D.C. It's just a huge gap in the historical research. So jumping from 1870 to 1900 is problematic, but it's all we've got. Okay? Now, other historians and archaeologists have written and studied about the Chinese in Montana as well. And a guy who's very reputable, he's an archaeologist by training, currently the State Historic Preservation Officer in Utah, did an archaeological survey of all the Chinese sites across Montana. It's a rich, rich source. Dr. Christopher Merritt out of the University of Montana made this great, great source. But he identified a problem. Lack of primary source data hinders the study of the Chinese in Montana, due, of course, to their generally low social status, the language barriers, and inherent racial stereotyping. Chinese simply do not fill the pages of historical documents. Few primary accounts from their perspective in Montana or China have been identified to date. So Dr. Merritt is saying there just isn't much that they left behind in their own hand, from their own communities, and this is a gap in the historical record. Okay, now when he wrote this, I think he was right when he says the Chinese do not fill the pages of historical documents. I hope I've corrected that a little bit, building on his work. So I've got a book out called The Middle Kingdom Under the Big Sky, A History of the Chinese Experience in Montana. I've got it for sale out in the front. It's $30 for each paperback. Okay, and I will be reading from it a little bit, kind of telling stories from it, as well as looking ahead to my next project that is going to be this visual, illustrated history of the Chinese in Montana. Working with an illustrator, we're trying to bring these stories to life in a different format. I'll talk about that in a bit too. And so Dr. Merritt wasn't wrong, but if only we could correct this, if only we could find some things that the Chinese in Montana left behind. Well, I did, and as I've been working in consultation with him and others, we began to populate that blank. And there are headstones across Montana that are in Chinese characters. There are envelopes, receipts, letters, 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 envelopes and letters. Now I found most of these at the Montana Historical Society up in Helena, but most of these are from Butte originally. Okay? And you can see that, I think you guys can all read that pretty clearly. Right? I laugh, but that's also the problem. So you find a bunch of things in Chinese, now what? Now what? Okay, this is an interesting political cartoon from Fort Benton. And here we've got a fascinating source that gives the Central Pacific Railroad, Reno, Nevada, Boise City, Ogden, Dillon, Montana Territory. Right? So there's some fascinating sources. When I found these at the Montana Historical Society, they said, we tried to get them translated, but we just didn't really have much luck on them. And they said, we don't know anybody who reads Chinese. Now remember where I was living and working at the time, Shanghai, China? I thought, great, I've got 27 million neighbors who can help translate this, no problem. It wasn't that easy, because the style of writing back then has changed. The traditional form of writing Chinese characters for thousands of years changed abruptly in 1949, 1950. As the communists won in the Chinese Civil War, one of the communist mandates is they wanted to spread literacy. This is very hard to learn and pass on, and so literacy was quite a thin gap of the aristocracy in China at the time. Communists wanted to spread it to the masses. They did. They simplified the form of writing, which led to massive gains in literacy. For my kind of purposes, it divorced 1.4 billion Chinese folks from being able to read the documents that I needed translated. Right? So when I took these to my Mandarin speaking and my Chinese reading friends in Shanghai, they could read about 30% of them. As I dug into this, it turns out the Montana Historical Society did have 2 other initiatives to try and translate these when they rediscovered them in the 1980s. One of them, again I mentioned my alma mater is Carroll College. There were 2 kids from China studying at Carroll in the early 1990s who got caught shoplifting. And the judge sentenced them to try and translate these documents at the Montana Historical Society. But nobody could really check their work, and so they did a little bit of work, and it turns out it wasn't very good. They also sent 3 of these letters, and there's hundreds of letters that I found. They sent 3 of these letters to a Chinese priest working at the University of Montana. He's from northern China, and he could read. He was old enough that he was trained to read in the traditional form of writing. And he read them. He gave them a cursory translation. He said they deal with family affairs. They are of no historical importance. He was right about the first one, wrong about the second one. But from a Chinese perspective, they're talking about emperors and dynasties and 5,000. They didn't think that the lives of a laundry worker or an immigrant cook were that important. So I understand his perspective. But I think that there is importance in the lives of everyday people and Chinese workers in the American West. So I decided to gather a crack team of researchers who could possibly crack this mystery. Here they are. Freshmen and sophomore students at the school that I was teaching at in Shanghai. Now I said that most people in Shanghai can't read the documents, but I also said I taught at an international school. Who lost that civil war to the communists in 1949? Chiang Kai-shek, Taiwan, and the nationalists. On the island of Taiwan, they keep the traditional form of writing alive, and in Hong Kong they do. So if I had families from Hong Kong and Taiwan, which I did, they could read these traditional characters. So working with these students, their mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, we created this intergenerational, transnational translation project to try and tell Montana's Chinese history for the first time ever in the words of the immigrants and the families themselves. I wrote grants to bring students to Helena, Montana from Shanghai. For about the first day when we were in Montana, all they did was stare at the sky, because it was blue during the day and they could see stars during the night, and the skies weren't blue when we were living in Shanghai and you couldn't see any stars. But we came to the Montana Historical Society in 2012 and again in 2014, and we worked to translate hundreds of these documents. It was a really exciting project, and these kids, that girl was a sophomore at the time, to see her work with her mother and her grandparents and to see them share this culture and the language and unlock these mysteries was really a great thing to witness. And so in my book I feature these stories. I'll read a couple now of the letters. Now these were letters written from southern China to 2 men working in Butte. Okay? Butte had, again, about 1,000 Chinese folks at the time. We think that the recipients of the letters were likely working in laundries in Butte. There was about 17 Chinese-run laundries in Butte. There was a laundry right across the street here in Bannack. So these are from southern China to men working in Butte. The letters that they would have written home, and they absolutely wrote home, are obviously in southern China and probably lost to history. But we can infer and connect the dots. I just want you to hear the pressure that these men are under. Okay, they're coming from a part of China so these are the letters that we translated, the envelopes that we translated, the receipts, things like that. They're coming from southern China, which was absolutely ravaged by horrible conditions. This is Guangdong province. You can see the city of Guangzhou or Canton in southern China. Specifically, though, they're coming from Taishan County. About 80% of the Chinese folks who came to North America came from this tiny county in southern China. It could fit about 50 times in our state of Montana, is how large Taishan County was. Absolutely ravaged, earthquakes, epidemics, droughts, floods, rebellions. Life was difficult in Taishan County, and so they had to go out to try and make anything of their life. So the men working across the street, or the women working across the street, or in Helena or Butte or Glasgow or Glendive, they were sending as much money as they could home to keep folks alive. This talks about how bad conditions were in Taishan County. Annual harvests provide food for half the year. The rest of the time, foreign rice must be bought. When ships cannot sail bringing money back from America to southern China, fires in kitchens immediately stop burning. A study in 1933 estimated that of the total money needed to run Taishan County, 80% of it was foreign earned. Okay, so in the guys working in the Pekin Cafe, the people working in noodle parlors, the people mining, that money was keeping people alive in southern China. The able-bodied go abroad, the fields are clogged with weeds, daughters are often drowned rather than raised. Horrible, choiceless choices, right? Now, in a Confucian society, these young men, mostly young men coming here, absolutely had a cultural imperative to support their parents and grandparents back home. It would have been disgraceful if they were not sending money back. But they also had a cultural imperative to get married and produce offspring that could venerate the ancestors after they died. And so the letters that we read, the letters that we translate, send more money, send more money, send more money, come home and get married, send more money, come home and get married. This constant tension was on these men at all times. Marriage prospects here were what I described. Earning prospects here weren't great. They were a heck of a lot better than in southern China. And so we read two brothers, one guy named De Chuan and another man named De Shu, are receiving these letters from southern China. De Chuan is the older brother, and it turns out he's sending money back and he's sending letters back as frequently as he can. De Shu has disappeared, is not holding up his part of the agreements. And so family writes, I still cannot find where brother De Shu is. No news and no money. As soon as you get information about De Shu, please write to tell us so we will not worry too much. You left our country for more than 20 years. Our family eagerly expects you to come back according to the original plan. It will be best that you get married here. You can have offspring for your forefathers and glorify our family. It is a fundamental family tradition. Now, De Shu does pop up again, but he's not sending money back and he's disgracing his family, and it's reflected in the letters. I hope you won't be like De Shu, who does not care for his parents and his ancestors' incense. He's not burning incense and giving offerings at their graves like he should to keep the spirits happy. He wanders outside and has changed his name. When he meets his brothers and cousins, he is sorrowful and ashamed. I am writing today to tell brother that in our village there is a piece of land with a house on it. Brother has been working outside the country for many years. I presume that you have a great flow of income from your very good business and that your hands are covered in gold. His hands are covered in sores. He's working in a steam laundry in Butte. Right? I am writing today to tell brother to decide on buying the house. We have to think about each other. Be a man, my brother. So this pressure on these guys, making the meager amounts that they were as a laundry worker or working in a noodle parlor and sending every penny back. In fact, some of the documents that we have show that De Chuan, this guy in Butte, is going into debt because he's sending so much money back home. And his brother hasn't carried his part of the bargain. So these are some of those letters. That's the letter I just read from. And you read from top to bottom, right to left, so it's greeting him, and then the salutations and the years here. We do have one letter from his mother, that's here in 1908. So his mother, we never hear from his father. in kind of making some historical leaps. We think his father maybe came to America to build the railroads, and they stopped hearing from him. And you can kind of guess maybe why that would have been the case. The pressure is still on De Chuan. Our kind mother is in very old age, towards the last few years of her life. If you've made your fortune, please come back home. This way you can repay mother the grace of her parenting, and our brothers can sit together, chat, and enjoy being together. Then mother writes, and this is the letter. Last month I was very sick, but luckily the illness is cured. However, I'm not completely recovered yet, thus money would be helpful. I only wish for your health, but please work hard. I wonder how many moms have written or thought the same thing in this next sentence to guys they have living in Butte. Don't waste your time wandering around in casinos or red light districts. When you get money, regardless of the amount, return home immediately. After that, you may return to work again. So this constant back and forth. And he doesn't go back. A lot of the Chinese were moving across the borders back and forth quite frequently. A lot of them had a wife back in southern China because it was almost an impossibility here. And so they would go back home, spend a couple of months, a year with their family, hopefully father a child, and then come back to work in the American West. We don't see De Chuan trying that. I think it's because he was here as a paper son. I think he was not here under legal means. After the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, he did not have the right to get in. I think he might have bought papers for somebody who had the right to get in and assumed that person's identity, which was a common ploy to get around the law. Now that might not seem righteous. To the Chinese, it didn't seem righteous that they were the only group told to stay out, especially because that happened in 1882. In 1868, they'd been welcomed in with open arms. Something called the Burlingame Treaty in 1868 said, we need workers. The American West is resource rich and labor poor. The 1868 Burlingame Treaty said, send us all the Chinese workers you can. And they built the Transcontinental Railroad. They built the Northern Pacific Railroad. And when they were done, the gate was barred to them. So I think they felt righteous in keeping people alive by doing work that they've been invited in to do anyways. Right? We then hear from Brother Deshu, the one who wasn't holding up his part of the bargains. He's limped back home. He's not making much money, but he writes to his brother. Mother is so old and weak now. When you have enough money to purchase a boat ticket, I hope that you can come home and visit. It's our biggest wish to see you come home. Our mother had been sick since last June. Sadly, she passed away the evening of September 18th last year. He's writing this in April. She died in September, and he's taken that long to write. Sorry that I didn't let you know earlier. Please forgive me. When Mother was sick, we deposited money for her treatment. It was not enough, and we still owe. We did receive your 100 silver yuan on April 7th. I'm also thankful for the 20 silver yuan you sent to me. Since we still owe money to others, could you please send us more so that we can clear our debts? How I hate that Mother has no money for burial. Right? So whether they've squandered it or what, it hasn't been enough. And our guy working in Butte has to continue to send more, even to pay Mother the respect of having her buried. Okay? So just the tensions on these folks and the hard life that they live was not easy. Now that's a micro history of De Chuan. Again, he didn't come to Bannack, he came to Butte. But I think we can really extrapolate for any of the Chinese working in Montana that they were under the same pressures, that they were trying to send as much money as they could home, trying to make a life of it here if they could, but that life was very, very difficult. And so we have his documents. We don't have them for the thousands of other Chinese in Montana, but we can extrapolate, we can interpret, we can make some educated guesses. Now on to across the street here in Bannack. We do have a number of artifacts that have surfaced from the Chinese community in Bannack. These are 2 Chinese coins. You can't see it great, but there's a square hole in the middle of them. These are probably from the 18th century, middle of the 1700s, based on the inscriptions on them. And Chinese coins frequently appear in any site with Chinese folks added in the American West. So we're not surprised to see it. 2 have surfaced. There is likely more in the grounds of Bannack, but we've got these beautiful buildings here and can't just go digging around. Usually archaeological excavations happen in a place like this when there's a need, when there's a leak, when there's a need to put in fire abatement services. And so before they put in the sprinkler system, they'll say, okay, let's dig, but let's carefully catalog things that rise up. And that's the important work of archaeologists. The round and then the square in it, that's a common shape for Chinese coins. One thought is that that square allows you to string like a piece of rawhide through there, or a string through there, and collect a lot of them and carry a lot of them together. Another is that the Chinese believe that heaven is round and the earth is square. So these are characteristic Chinese coins. Across the street at the Bannack place, which we think might have been a Chinese laundry, we see a number of pieces of shards of Chinese ceramics rising up. These are what are called four-season flower ceramics. You can see the delicate flower patterns, and these are absolutely in keeping with Chinese settlement in the American West. Sometimes you'll hear about double happiness motifs and stuff like that. That was from a little bit earlier period of Chinese ceramics. It was found mostly in California and Nevada in the 1850s and 60s. Double happiness ceramics aren't really found in Montana that frequently. So the four-season flower absolutely is in keeping with what we've seen in Helena, with what we've seen in Highland, other places where there have been archaeological digs across Montana. This is Chinese brown glazed stoneware. This is more utilitarian. And so this would have shipped things from China like wheat, soy, fermented meals, soy sauce, things like that. It would have been in jug form. So the Chinese brown glazed stoneware, you can see that brownish, and then the type of material there has been found across the street at the Bassett place, and again the Ritalik house just across the street. The most exciting ones, I think, are these. These used to be called celadon. Now they're more properly called wintergreen ceramics. Made in China and shipped. They're possibly a teacup, a bowl, some shard of maybe a teacup as well. And you can see marks on them. Okay. This stamp is likely what's called a reign mark, like the reign of the emperor, and it dates when that piece of ceramics would have been made. It's not necessarily trustworthy because ceramic shops would have artificially put a much older date on it to give it an air of kind of age and importance. But it does help us make the assertion that these are absolutely from China and made their way here to Bannack. This one here is a single Chinese character, and oftentimes teacups would have a single Chinese character that meant something auspicious, that meant something inspiring for the drinkers to be reminded to transcend their daily difficulties and to take heart in that auspicious sign. This is the sign for eye or vision. Eye or vision. So kind of an auspicious mark there. Now, anytime you're talking about the Chinese in the West, people always want to know about opium. Opium. Okay. Opium was indeed used by the Chinese. It was used by the non-Chinese. It was not illegal in Montana until 1909. So it was a legal drug that could be used. In 1881, it was made illegal to sell it kind of out of a business, but it was proper to be used. And for the Chinese, they used it much like non-Chinese groups used alcohol. A kind of a pain reliever, a stress reliever. It absolutely could be abused, but used in moderation. It was just a part of the culture. Oftentimes, and you can't see it right here, this is a tiny little glass vial. Oftentimes at archaeological sites, you'll find these tiny glass vials, and they absolutely are Chinese, and you'll hear people get really excited and say, oh, that's opium, that's opium, that's opium. Like this guy on Facebook. Very cool, similar to this extract of opium bottle. See how tiny that is? These are not opium containers. These are likely tinctures of Chinese medicine, sure, but opium didn't ship in a liquid form. It shipped in kind of a sticky paste form. So getting it into this tiny vial and getting it out of that tiny vial would have been impossible. Instead, opium shipped in something that we'll see a little bit later on called opium tins. But oftentimes we get so excited about the use of opium that we ascribe anything that we find in a Chinese dig to be, oh, this must be opium. Similarly, there's another vial. Now, I will say here at Bannack, the folks have been very good about resisting that myth and not calling this vial an opium vial. Okay. That's found here across the street. Great. 2 examples of it. This was misascribed early on and has been corrected in the Bannack Archaeological Register. This was called an opium pipe. You can see it's a metallic pipe that has that right angle. This is probably instead a Chinese tobacco pipe. Opium is smoked in a different way than tobacco. Tobacco is burned and that smoke is inhaled through the stem. That long stem helps cool it down before it gets into the lungs. But this would pretty much certainly be a Chinese tobacco pipe, not an opium pipe. Okay? Opium was smoked out of a pipe like this. Okay? This is a clay bowl here. Here's the mouthpiece. And opium would have been taken out of the tin and kind of a really sticky, almost like taffy type consistency, and worked to make it a little bit pliable, held over a flame to begin to have some of the water in there evaporate, worked it more, worked it more, worked it more, and then put it into here and smeared around here, and then inhaled, and it's more of the vapors that are coming to you rather than the smoke. Okay? I've always thought we should do a demonstration of this, but that might be it's more of the vapors coming in rather than the burned tobacco cigarette smoke. Okay. This is a sherd from an opium pipe found here in Bannack. And it absolutely accounts with the type of ceramics, the type of clay, the color that it would have been. So this piece here, this tiny piece here, would have been a part of this opium bowl here. Okay. So we do have a history of opium usage here in Bannack. Whether it was a white guy using it or a Chinese guy using it, who really knows? Here's a comical newspaper account of the time of how that would have been smoked. As I mentioned, it didn't ship in those little vials. It shipped in what we usually call opium tins, even though that tin is not necessarily a tin can. Here are the metal forms that opium shipped in, and these three were found here in Bannack. It's more of a box, and so the opium paste would have been shipped in here, and then you get it out with the needles and work it, heat it, put it into the bowl, and imbibe it there. So 3 different opium so-called tins found here in Bannack. Pretty exciting finds. They were very durable and useful, so they were often repurposed after the fact. Right? So these would have been some sort of container after the opium had been consumed. Okay. Now Bannack, all of these things, the four-season flower ceramics, the wintergreen ceramics, the Chinese brown glaze stoneware, the opium, all of these came all the way from southern China. And so the Bannack's Chinese community was absolutely interconnected with a global trade network. To my knowledge, I have not seen any reference to there being a Chinese mercantile here. It didn't have a large enough community to really have a merchant here. I think the Chinese in Bannack would have gone down to Dillon, where there absolutely were Chinese merchants, to buy these products, brought straight from the homeland, and that Chinese merchant would have been the one who sent your money back to southern China through their arrangements. So the Chinese merchant shop in Dillon would have been where they got their needs met. But to be part of this really transnational, global network here in our small town of Bannack is pretty exciting. Now, this is not the small town of Bannack, but this does show an important event that I want to talk about and end today with on a little bit of analysis. Anybody want to guess? These are all white folks here, and these people in white are Chinese. This is in Missoula on Front Street. You can see that's Mount Sentinel and Mount Jumbo's over here. Anybody want to guess what event is being celebrated with this picture? Funeral. The color for death for the Chinese and in southern China is white. And so these are mourners bringing the body out from Chinatown, out to the base of Mount Jumbo, where it would have been interred. And then you see that smoke. It's not cremation that's happening there. It's burning of offerings to keep the spirit of the recently departed happy. The type of things that would have been burnt: money like this. So money that could be transformed from the present day usage into the usage for the person in the spirit world. This is not legal tender, like this piece here. If you look at this $100 bill on one side, it looks a little different on the other side. And Chinese still do this today, to burn offerings to make them useful not for here and now, but in the spirit world. If you don't do that, the spirit wanders as a hungry ghost. And so they would have been burning clothing, burning anything that could be useful to the recently departed. And you look at just the hundreds of people looking on with really intense interest here in this cemetery in Missoula. And Montana's newspapers reported breathlessly about Chinese funeral traditions, because it would go through the heart of town, and there'd be gongs banging and strange things happening, and bringing plates of pork and rice wine and whiskey out to the gravesite. So it was quite an affair. The thing to note here is Chinese cemeteries tend to be on the edge of town and on the edge of known cemeteries. This is actually the Chinese cemetery that's pictured here. It's currently under a residential district in Missoula, the Rattlesnake neighborhood of Cherry Street. And so people, as they dig their gardens, or people who have basements in that area, find some interesting things at times. Speaking of finding interesting things, that's where we're getting to. Other cemeteries in Montana, there's Chinese cemeteries all across Montana because there were Chinese folks all across Montana. Usually if you're looking for a Chinese cemetery, look on the edge of non-Chinese cemeteries. This is Forest Vale Cemetery in Helena. This is where some of the founding fathers of Montana are buried there. Guys with names like Holter and Hauser and Sanders and Beadler. Guys like that are buried there. Just outside the well-kept grounds of Forest Vale is what's called China Row Cemetery. Just on the prairie and prickly pear cactus and sagebrush. Right? But that's where the Chinese were buried. About 200 Chinese were buried there. To date, only about 6 headstones remain there. So if you're just looking out there, it looks like just there weren't that many. We can talk about why that is in a second. Excitingly here, this is Bannack's old cemetery just up the hill. You can see the entrance point is right here. In the southwest corner of this area, we think that it's a place where a Chinese cemetery still resides. And this has only come about in about the last year. Susie, do you want to tell us about how you worked to find this and get eyes on it?
So I met the archaeologist here. I'm an archaeologist, and so I'm always kind of wandering around all over the place. And she was going to do a survey of the homes and the buildings. And I told her I'd been up to the cemetery and noticed the cemetery or the burials that were empty, so forth. So we went and did another survey and started from the top of the cemetery and did lines back and forth and found ceramics.
Yep.
And we found a few before, but not enough to tell us. And for sure at the bottom end of our, so it'd be the, let's see, north and south side of the cemetery, there were ceramics. And outside of the fenced area of our cemetery, we also have other burials. So this is something we're excited about, but also feel responsible for too. And so the archaeologist and Mitzi, who was part of the project, documented that, shared it with you, brought you back out here. And pretty sure that's what it was.
I was tearing up the road after I got that email to get down here and see it because the snow, who knows when the snows are going to fly, right? It's August, we could get snow. But this, so I came here after that notice, and you're also saying that outside of there's ceramics outside. And so what we see up there, based on the leads given by the great people doing great work, are Chinese brown glazed stoneware. Right here and right here. We also see four-season flower ceramics, winter green ceramics, just like we found across the street, find them up the hill. What likely happened is a couple of things. At the time of burial, there would have been offerings given for the spirit at that time, to feed the spirit. That would have been teacups of tea, baijiu, rice whiskey, rice, different food things, and it would have been left there. And so over the years it would have gotten broken and things like that. Also at likely 2 other times during the year, there would have been offerings given. Hungry Ghost Festival, which this year will be September 6th, and more importantly, Tomb Sweeping Festival, Qingming Festival, which this year will be April 5th. People of Chinese culture would have gone to that part of the cemetery and left offerings to feed the spirits. And so we still have fragments of that on the ground up there. Just within the last year this has been discovered. I absolutely think that's a Chinese section of the cemetery. Ooh, the ghosts aren't happy with this. Anybody bring any baijiu to feed the spirits? Okay. I absolutely think it is, based on the ceramics that we found there and the location of it. Okay, that location is marginalized on the edge of other cemeteries. That's Chance True's Butte's Mount Moriah Cemetery, Billings is Mount View Cemetery, Helena's China Row Cemetery, Livingston's Mount View Cemetery. Anytime there's a Chinese section, it's going to be on the edge. Not by law, I just think it evolved that way, but I absolutely think that there were Chinese people buried there. Hopefully they're not there anymore, because the cultural tradition would be that falling leaves return to the tree, is the Chinese saying. They would have wanted their bones exhumed, respectfully cleaned, and returned for reburial back in southern China, so that descendants could venerate the ancestors and feed those spirits. They don't have kids here, so they don't have the next generation to feed the spirits. So they would have fully expected 5 to 7 years after their interment for bone collectors to sweep through the American West, identify who's buried where, exhume the bones, clean anything off of them, and send those bones back for reburial. So I hope that there's no Chinese remains remaining up there. And we do see some evidence of depressions where exhumation likely happened. So it's a very, very exciting find. Those who are interested and up for it, I'm going to hike up the hill there afterwards. I think Susie and Brittany are going to come up too. We'll be happy to show you that spot and point out the glass that's left behind and the different types of ceramics that are left behind, leaving everything behind when we leave too. Okay? So this is a very exciting development in Bannack's Chinese history. My next project, which just fell off the wall, is this illustrated work that I'm working on with my son, Thomas, who's currently a sophomore in high school, and he's studying Chinese and studying history. And we've got a partner named Rich Lee, born and raised in San Francisco's Chinatown and now lives in San Jose. He's an illustrator, and he's working to try and bring these stories to life in this way. This is outside my hometown of Great Falls. This is our character, De Chuan, who the letters were written to. And we say that he was the guy who went to Great Falls and tried to start that laundry, is kicked out, and then eventually goes to Butte. Speaking of buttes, this is Square Butte by Cascade. And Rich, when we brought him up here to Montana, fell in love with another Montana artist, and has a little homage in that drawing. Do you see it there? A little Charlie Russell skull there, right? He loved the work of Charlie Russell. Rich, born and raised in a Chinese-American community in California, had no idea that there were Chinese folks in Montana. So we're spreading this message and trying to get the word out. Here's kind of how he works. We give him primary sources. He turns them into sketches and then turns them into the illustrated version. That gentleman there. This guy here who catches him in the actual story. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to something like this as a graphic novel. Right? Novel indicates fiction. This is nonfiction. This is based in primary source historical research. This guy here is X Beadler. Those of you who know Montana history know X Beadler, kind of the muscle for the vigilante movement. He actually does catch this Chinese individual and lynches him in Helena in 1870. So here's a picture. This is what we do. We find historical documents, push them to our illustrator, and he then bases his illustrations from them. There's the historical photo, and here's how Rich is bringing it to life. So we're working with as many of the documents as we can find. We're trying to tell the stories based on those translated documents. This is definitely based on my first book, as you know, which is for sale out there, $30 a piece. Happy to have your support. But also this next book, we're doing a thing where you can sponsor a page of the book. For a tax-deductible donation of $300 to the Foundation for Montana History, you can sponsor one of the pages, you'll get your name in the acknowledgments, and you can help what we think is an important project come to life. I've got information on that out there. I think you can tell I could talk about this all day, but Brittany's giving me the look like, hey. I love what I do. I love to get to share it with an interested audience, and I thank you for being here today. I think we've got some time for questions if your interest level and energy allows. Yes, sir.
I noticed that they have a first and last name, no middle name. Is that pretty common?
Okay, so normally what will happen is they'll have the family name and it will be given first. Okay, so like another guy that I worked on, he's from the Hum family, so he is Hum Wing Hong. In Chinese culture, it's more important that you represent your family than that you represent your individual self, right? So Hum Wing Hong. Usually first names are two names. So like our guys De Chuan and De Shu, we just don't know what family they were from. So they would probably be De Chuan Hum De Chuan or Wang De Shu. We're just not sure what family they were from. Great question. Other questions? Yeah.
Were the other Asians treated the same way?
Great question. There were other Asian communities here. Eventually there was a Korean community here. There was a Japanese community here. The Japanese were not treated the same as the Chinese. And the reason was that the Qing dynasty, which was China's ruling government, was extraordinarily weak at this time, and Japan's government was getting stronger and stronger at this time. Japan had just defeated China in 1894-95, and Japan would surprise the world and defeat Russia in 1905. And actually, like, government officials in Montana knew that. And so when asked, like, are you gonna, like, discriminate against the Japanese like you are the Chinese? One government official in Lewistown says, no, the Japanese government would never let us. Which, it's tough. But the Chinese government was in such disarray, it was barely keeping things together back in China, let alone trying to advocate for its citizens abroad. And China arrogantly at the time considered itself the Middle Kingdom. That's the title of my book, The Middle Kingdom, like the center of the universe, right? They thought that anybody who would leave the Middle Kingdom didn't deserve protection. Now that was until all those monies started flowing back in, and they said, oh, maybe you guys do have something to offer. But great question. The Japanese, I don't want to say it was easy to be Japanese here, but because their government was stronger, they did have more protection. Good question.
Were the Chinese allowed to mine the Bannack?
Yes.
Did they continue to mine after everybody else left?
Good question. So early on, they absolutely were involved in the 1860s in placer mining, definitely. Panning and sluicing, absolutely. When it got into lode mining, less so. Now there was an 1872 law that prohibited the Chinese from owning property in Montana. And that was enforced at some times and not at other times. But it was hard for the Chinese to get mining claims. They tended to not get the first pickings and instead kind of mine the tailings that had been left behind. Sometimes I'm sure you've heard these stories of the Chinese kind of sneaking under the cabins of white miners and getting the gold dust that sifted through. I think that's kind of mythology in the absence of the Chinese here to tell their story, and kind of this like, oh, they were somewhat sneaky or something like that. When they mined like anybody else, and they made some money and they went broke at times too. When we think of mining, obviously we think of panning and sluicing, you know, placer mining, but then that lode mining, for instance, in Butte with those miles and miles of tunnels, right? Butte we think of as the richest hill on earth. The Chinese were not allowed to work in the underground mines in Butte, right? So it's a complicated history. When placer mining did happen, they absolutely were out there doing it. Yeah, good question.
What research have you found on the cooks and that were on ranches and how they came in?
Yeah, so a lot of ranches, in fact, it was almost like a status symbol to have a Chinese cook, right? And oftentimes they were Chinese men because not very many women. The interesting thing is, back in southern China, these guys didn't mine for gold. They mined for gold here. Back in southern China, they didn't build railroads. They built railroads here. These men back in southern China didn't cook, and they cook here. And they didn't work in laundries or restaurants, and they do that here. The one thing they did back in southern China that they did here, it was agricultural back in southern China. They were farmers. And so what would be keeping in continuity with that here? Vegetable gardening. So every place where there was Chinese settlement, they were growing vegetables. Whether for their own consumption or for sale, Chinese vegetable gardening helped dietary diversity in mining camps across Montana. To the issue of cooks, like I said, it was a bit of a status symbol to have a Chinese cook, but that could come back to bite you. At moments when anti-Chinese sentiment rose, if you had a Chinese cook, you might be seen as kind of aiding a group that a lot of people didn't want in the region. I don't know that they were cooking many Chinese dishes on those ranches, more of doing the work to feed the hungry workers. The stuff that they made in the noodle parlors in Dillon or Butte or Helen or Missoula was Chinese American food. It definitely was kind of an adaptation to the realities here. So sometimes, like when I lived in China, people would be like, oh, do they have chow mein? Do they have that? I'm like, kind of, but it's different than what we have. So it really evolved here in ways that, chop suey is the best example. Chop suey isn't known to people in southern China. Chow mein, at least mian is the word for noodles. That was known in southern China. But it evolved in pretty interesting ways here. Cheap food, hearty, filling for miners, for workers to get a quick meal. And a lot of times for working girls to get a quick meal. Oftentimes Chinatowns abutted red light districts. Sometimes people think it was more like this. And so any Chinese woman they see must by definition be a prostitute. I don't ascribe to that overgeneralization. But a lot of times the working girls, white working girls or African American working girls or whoever it was, would eat in the cheaper chop suey joints in Chinatown. Good. Other questions?
Recently, I did a tour in Virginia City where there was a marginalized population and their cemetery had fallen off the map and they had to bring in cadaver dogs.
Yeah.
Would you think this cemetery up there would be looked at considering that expense?
It's a good question. The cemetery that I showed in Helena brought in cadaver dogs to research that China Row section that I mentioned. And you know what the dogs found? There were a bunch of people buried there. You know what the records show? There were a bunch of people buried there. So I don't know that that was the most useful use of resources, because even if a body has been exhumed 80 years ago, there are still traces in that soil, and the dogs are going to hit. And And so it didn't really enlighten things. If you're wondering, like, is this area a cemetery? Then cadaver dogs could possibly be useful. I think what we would find up there is a bunch of hits. I think it would be interesting, as Susie mentioned, to see how far it extends outside of the normal fenced-in boundaries of the cemetery. That would be interesting. I'm not sure what the cost of that would be. It might prove some insights, but we know people were buried there. I think the first step would be to do an exhaustive search in the records to see if we could find any plots, any documents that say where folks were buried. It's a good question. Other questions?
Are you aware of Tommy Haw?
Tommy Haw, yeah, a little bit. It's a fascinating story. Ranching and cowboying, right?
Right, it is.
Tell us more.
Well, all I know about it is just what I have read and done research on here when I was the director of the museum, is that he was discovered by one of the Orr brothers in a burned out village. And he found this little boy hidden, put him in the saddle, took him back, and he lived with the Orrs for the rest of his life. And Mrs. Orr taught him to read and write English and to do math and all those things. And he was treated as their son.
Yeah.
Could never say Orr. And that's why he called himself Tommy Haw.
Tommy Haw, yeah. It's interesting. So, it wasn't easy to be Chinese here, but there are moments where there was great crossover and overlap and white allyship and partnerships. Thankfully, Montana never had a major bloodletting against its Chinese residents, and that's not the case in neighboring states. In Wyoming in 1885, there was something called the Rock Springs Massacre. About 30 Chinese miners were killed. Okay? They were expelled violently from Tacoma and Seattle in 1885 as well. On the border between Idaho and Oregon in 1887, there was a Chinese massacre of about 37 miners. In Montana, we had similar numbers of Chinese and similar issues going on, but the major bloodletting never happened. Again, I don't say that it was easy to be Chinese here, but for whatever reason, there was not a major massacre of the Chinese. I think there's one moment, and I write about this in an article I did a couple of years ago, there's one moment where that might have happened. It happened in Butte in 1880, 1881, when Chinese wood choppers were contracted to bring in 10,000 cords of wood after white workers said, we won't work we need these wages. The smelter went out and said, we're not going to pay that, we're going to pay the Chinese this much. Chinese said, sure. And so they went down 13 miles south of Butte and were trying to bring in this wood, and those same white workers who had said, we need to work for this much, 216 of them rode out of Butte to try and do harm to the Chinese wood choppers, 40 Chinese wood choppers. My assertion is this was the moment when the tensions were highest and could have led to a tragedy of bloodshed. 216 angry, armed white workers riding down on 40 Chinese. One guy, this constable named Constable E.T. Owen, he was in his 70s at the time, he said, not on my watch. He rode out of Butte, got ahead of the 216 and literally put his body between the 216 angry mob and the 40 Chinese workers, and he read the mob the Riot Act. There really is something called the Riot Act. He said, you are in violation of the Riot Act, and you're in violation of a legal contract. These Chinese folks, though they're not citizens, signed a contract, and they have the right to uphold that contract. I think this one guy's righteous stand might have prevented a Montana Rock Springs, to be honest with you. We're featuring that in the upcoming book that you see here. That's chapter 2. My son and I call that chapter The War of the Woods. And we look at that moment of white allyship standing up for his Chinese neighbors. I don't know if he had any love for his Chinese neighbors, but he said, this is not right, and I'm going to take righteous action to try and protect these Montanans. Again, if you'd like to sponsor a page of that, $300 tax deductible, get in touch with me. There's bookmarks out on the desk that tell you how to do that. Or if you just like the art, the bookmark is actually this image. So if you just want to take one of those bookmarks, that's fine. It also tells you how you sponsor a page. I'm going to be here to sign books if you want to buy a book or talk more about anything that's on your mind. And then maybe 30 minutes from now, if anybody wants to hike up to the old cemetery and see what we think is the Chinese section, you're definitely welcome to join us. We'll leave about 30 minutes from now. Look, it's 4:06. Is there a better time to end the talk? Montana time, right? Thank you very much.